The fading light of dusk painted the dusty streets of Pyramid City, Nevada, with hues of amber and gold as Hannah Morgan hurried from the general store, clutching her meager purchases to her chest. The whispers followed her like shadows, just as they always did, hushed voices that carried through the thin walls of the millinery shop where she worked, or floated across the porch of the boarding house where she lived. Plain as a flour sack, they said. That Morgan girl might be hard-working, but no man's ever going to look twice at her. At 22, Hannah had learned to steel herself against such words, but that didn't mean they didn't find their mark. Nevada Territory, 1870, was no place for a woman alone, especially one without family or beauty to recommend her. Hannah kept her eyes down as she walked, avoiding the stares of the townsfolk who had long ago decided her fate. Her simple brown dress hung loosely on her tall, angular frame, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical knot that did nothing to soften her features. The small scar above her left eyebrow, a reminder of the smallpox that had claimed her parents 5 years prior, only added to what the town matrons called her unfortunate appearance. "Evening, Miss Morgan." The deep voice startled her, causing her to nearly drop the brown paper parcel containing thread and buttons for her mending work. Hannah looked up to see Sheriff Wallace standing outside the jailhouse, his gray mustache twitching with a friendly smile. "Evening, Sheriff," she replied with a quick nod, continuing on her way. The sheriff was one of the few people in town who treated her with genuine kindness. He'd been the one to help her find work after her parents' deaths, ensuring she wasn't sent to an orphanage despite being already 17. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rutted Main Street as Hannah made her way to Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. The 2-story clapboard building had been her home for the past 5 years, though home seemed a generous term for a place where she was constantly reminded of her status as an object of pity. "You're late for supper, Mrs." Peterson said sharply as Hannah entered the dining room where the other boarders were already seated. "We can't all wait on you, you know." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Peterson. Mr. Finch kept the store open late today," Hannah apologized, taking her usual seat at the far end of the table. The other boarders, 2 schoolteachers, an elderly accountant, and a young clerk from the bank, barely acknowledged her presence. "Well, you're fortunate I saved you a plate at all," the older woman said with a sniff, placing a dish of cooling stew before Hannah. "Though I suppose it's not as if you had a gentleman caller waiting." The titters from the schoolteachers made Hannah's cheeks burn. She focused on her food, spooning the lukewarm stew carefully, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "Did you hear?" Miss Roberts, the younger of the 2 teachers, leaned forward conspiratorially. "The Anderson Ranch has a new foreman. They say he's from Texas." "I heard he's quite handsome," the other teacher, Miss Wilson, added with a meaningful glance at Hannah. "Though I doubt Miss Morgan here would notice such things." Hannah kept her eyes on her plate, though the familiar ache of loneliness pressed against her chest. It wasn't that she didn't notice men, she did. She noticed their averted gazes when she entered a room, the way conversations stopped when she approached, how they never asked her to dance at the occasional town socials she attended. After dinner, Hannah retreated to her small room on the 2nd floor. The space was modest but neat: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small desk, and a trunk containing the few possessions she had salvaged from her parents' home. A worn Bible sat on the nightstand, alongside a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother had been beautiful, with soft features and a gentle smile that Hannah had inherited neither of. She changed into her nightgown and sat at the small desk, taking out her journal. Writing had become her solace, the pages of her journal the only place she could express her true thoughts without fear of judgment or mockery. "Another day," she wrote by the light of a single candle, "another reminder of what I am not, Mrs. Peterson implied again today that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness come my way, as if I am not entitled to the same considerations as prettier girls. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps this is all there is for someone like me: work and solitude until old age claims me. Still, in my heart, I cannot help but hope for something more, even as I know such hopes are foolish." She closed the journal, tucking it beneath her mattress where it would remain hidden from prying eyes. Tomorrow would bring more of the same working at the millinery shop, enduring the pitying glances and not-so-subtle remarks about her appearance, and returning to her lonely room to dream impossible dreams. As Hannah drifted off to sleep, she was unaware that miles away, on the road to Pyramid City, a man was about to arrive who would challenge everything the town and she herself believed about her future. The sun beat down mercilessly on Hank Anderson's broad shoulders as he guided his horse along the dusty trail toward Pyramid City. At 30, Hank had seen his share of hardship across the expanses of the western frontier. The years of cattle driving and ranch work had weathered his face, leaving it tanned and lined, though not unpleasantly so. His dark hair curled beneath the brim of his Stetson, and his blue eyes had a way of seeing through pretense that made many uncomfortable. He'd come from the Triple R Ranch in Texas, where he'd worked as a foreman until the owner's son had taken over and made it clear he wanted his own man in the position. The Anderson Ranch in Nevada had advertised for an experienced foreman, and Hank had answered the call, eager for a fresh start far from the memories that haunted him in Texas. As Pyramid City came into view, Hank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The town wasn't much to look at: a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, the church steeple rising above the surroundings, the inevitable saloon with its swinging doors, but it represented possibility. No one here knew him or the burden he carried. Here he could simply be Hank Anderson, ranch foreman, a man who kept to himself and did his job well. He guided his horse to the livery stable, where a boy of about 16 looked up from his work. "Afternoon," Hank greeted him, dismounting with a fluid motion that belied his large frame. "I'm looking to stable my horse and find a place to stay for the night. You can leave him here," the boy replied, eyeing Hank's mount with appreciation. "As for staying, Mrs. Peterson runs the only boarding house in town. It's just down the street, can't miss it." "Much obliged," Hank said, handing the boy a coin. "Take good care of him. He's carried me a long way." With his saddle bag slung over his shoulder, Hank made his way down the main street, aware of the curious glances from the townsfolk. A newcomer was always a subject of interest in small towns like this one, and he nodded politely to those he passed, though he didn't stop to chat. The boarding house was a well-maintained 2-story building with a small sign proclaiming Peterson's Boarding House, clean rooms, decent meals. Hank climbed the steps to the front porch and knocked on the door. A stout woman with gray hair pulled severely back from her face answered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes assessing him critically. "Madam," Hank said, removing his hat. "I'm Hank Anderson, the new foreman at the Anderson Ranch. I'm looking for a room for the night. I'll be heading out to the ranch tomorrow." The woman's demeanor changed instantly, her stern expression melting into something more welcoming. "Mr. Anderson, we've been expecting you. I'm Mrs. Peterson. Please come in. I have a fine room available." She ushered him into a tidy parlor, then bustled off to retrieve a ledger. "You're in luck," she said. "We have a front room available with a view of the street. It's our best accommodation." "That'll be fine," Hank said, though any room with a bed would have sufficed after days on the trail. As Mrs. Peterson led him upstairs to show him the room, she kept up a steady stream of chatter. "The Andersons are one of our finest families. Mr. Anderson's grandfather was one of the first settlers in this area. The ranch is quite prosperous, cattle mostly, but some horses too. You'll be taking meals with us while you're here, of course. Breakfast is at 6, dinner at noon for those in town, and supper at 6 in the evening." The room was simple but clean, with a bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. "This will do nicely," Hank said, setting his saddlebags on the bed. "Supper will be served in an hour," Mrs. Peterson informed him. "The dining room is at the end of the hall downstairs." "You'll meet our other boarders then." Left alone, Hank took the opportunity to wash away the dust of the trail. He poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed his face and hands, then changed into a clean shirt. His reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a face that had seen its share of sun and wind, but he was satisfied that he looked presentable enough for dinner in a respectable boarding house. When the dinner bell rang, Hank made his way downstairs to the dining room. 3 women and 2 men were already seated at the large table, and they looked up with undisguised curiosity as he entered. "Ah, Mr. Anderson," Mrs. Peterson said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please join us. Allow me to introduce our other boarders. Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson are teachers at our school. Mr. Perkins is the accountant at the bank, and Mr. Simmons works there as well." Hank nodded to each in turn, noting the fluttery smiles from the 2 teachers. The 3rd woman, seated at the far end of the table, had not been introduced. She kept her eyes down, focused on arranging her napkin in her lap. She was tall and slender, with chestnut hair pulled back in a simple style. While not conventionally pretty, there was something striking about her reserved demeanor. "And that's Miss Morgan," Mrs. Peterson added as an afterthought. "She works at the millinery shop." The woman, Miss Morgan, looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Hank's for just a moment before returning to her plate. In that brief glance, Hank saw intelligence and a wariness that piqued his curiosity. "Pleased to meet you all," he said, taking his seat. The meal proceeded, with the other boarders peppering Hank with questions about his background and his journey to Pyramid City. He answered politely but briefly, preferring to listen rather than speak about himself. He noticed that Miss Morgan remained silent throughout the meal, eating quietly while the conversation flowed around her as if she were invisible. "Miss Morgan is our resident wallflower," Miss Roberts said with a laugh that didn't quite mask the unkindness of her words. "Aren't you, dear?" The woman's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't respond, continuing to eat with careful precision. "Not everyone needs to be the center of attention, Miss Roberts," Hank said mildly, but with a firmness that caused the teacher's smile to falter. A brief, awkward silence fell over the table before Mr. Perkins cleared his throat and changed the subject to the recent improvements to the town's roads. As the meal concluded, Hank noticed Miss Morgan slipping away quietly while the others lingered over coffee. He found himself wondering about her story and why the others seemed to treat her with such dismissive condescension. Later that evening, as Hank stood on the porch smoking a cigarette and enjoying the cool night air, he heard voices from inside the parlor where the door had been left slightly ajar. "I don't see why you seated him next to us and not next to Hannah," Miss Wilson was saying. "It's not as if she's likely to find a husband any other way." Now, Mrs. Peterson's voice replied, "even a man fresh from the trail deserves a pleasant dinner companion. Besides, they said no man would want a woman so plain as Hannah Morgan. It would be cruel to encourage false hopes." Hank frowned, disturbed by the callousness of their words. He'd seen enough of life to know that true beauty rarely resided on the surface, and the casual cruelty with which these women dismissed Miss Morgan spoke poorly of their own character. He stubbed out his cigarette and went back inside, making enough noise to alert the women to his presence. As he passed the parlor, he nodded politely but continued to his room, deep in thought about the quiet woman at the end of the table and the unkind judgment that had been passed upon her. Hannah woke before dawn, as was her habit, dressing quickly in the dim light filtering through her small window. She moved quietly through the boarding house, not wanting to disturb the other residents, especially the new arrival. The brief moment when her eyes had met his at dinner the previous night had left her oddly unsettled. There had been something in his gaze, not pity, not the usual quick dismissal she was accustomed to, but a genuine seeing that had made her uncomfortable in its unfamiliarity. The kitchen was empty, and Hannah helped herself to a cup of coffee and a piece of bread before heading out into the still dark morning. She enjoyed these solitary walks before the town awakened, the quiet moments when she could pretend she was just like everyone else, not the object of whispers and pitying glances. The millinery shop where Hannah worked wouldn't open for several hours yet, but Mrs. Winters, the owner, allowed Hannah to come in early to work on special orders. Hannah had a talent with needle and thread that even her harshest critics couldn't deny, and her embroidery work was sought after by those who could afford such luxuries. She let herself into the back of the shop with the key Mrs. Winters had entrusted to her, lighting a lamp and settling at her workstation. The half-finished bonnet before her was destined for Mrs. Anderson, the wife of Hannah's new neighbor at the boarding house's employer, and needed to be completed before the upcoming church social. As her fingers worked deftly, adding delicate stitches to the cream-colored satin, Hannah allowed her mind to wander. She thought of the new ranch foreman and his unexpected defense of her at dinner. It wasn't that she needed defending, she had grown accustomed to Miss Roberts' barbs, but the simple courtesy had been so unexpected that she hadn't known how to respond. "He was just being polite," she murmured to herself. "Don't read anything into it." The bell above the shop door jingled, startling Hannah from her thoughts. The sun had risen while she worked, and Mrs. Winters bustled in, shedding her shawl. "Already at work, I see," the older woman said approvingly. "That's why I keep you on, Hannah. No one can fault your industry, even if—" She trailed off, but Hannah could finish the sentence in her head, "even if there's little else to recommend you, Mrs. Anderson's bonnet will be ready by tomorrow," Hannah said, keeping her voice even. "Excellent. She'll be wanting to wear it to church on Sunday." Mrs. Winters moved around the shop, opening curtains and arranging displays. "Did you hear about the new foreman at the Anderson ranch?" "I hear he arrived yesterday." "Yes," Hannah replied, focusing on a particularly intricate stitch. "He's staying at Mrs. Peterson's." "Is he now?" Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow. "Well, I imagine Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson will be making quite a fuss over him. Men are scarce enough in these parts without adding one who comes with a respectable position." Hannah made a noncommittal sound, unwilling to engage in gossip about the new arrival. It made no difference to her whether the schoolteachers set their caps for him. Such matters were so far removed from her own experience as to seem almost foreign. The morning passed quickly as customers came and went. Hannah stayed in the back room, working on orders and emerging only when Mrs. Winters needed assistance with a particularly demanding patron. It was nearly noon when the bell jingled again, and Hannah looked up to see Hank Anderson ducking his tall frame through the doorway. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the temples. His blue eyes scanned the shop before landing on Hannah, and a smile touched his lips. "Miss Morgan," he greeted her with a nod. Hannah felt a flush rising to her cheeks at being directly addressed. "Mr. Anderson," she replied, quickly lowering her gaze to the counter. "How can we help you today?" Mrs. Winters hurried forward from where she had been arranging ribbons. "Mr. Anderson, welcome to Pyramid City. I'm Mrs. Winters, the proprietress. Are you looking for something for a lady friend, perhaps?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Nothing so interesting, I'm afraid. I'm in need of a new hat band. This one's seen better days." He indicated the worn leather band around his Stetson. Of course," Mrs. Winters said, clearly disappointed that his errand was so mundane. "Hannah, show Mr. Anderson our selection of hat bands." Hannah led him to a small display case where various strips of leather and woven bands were arranged. "These are our standard offerings," she explained, her voice softer than she intended. "But we can also create something custom if you have a particular design in mind." He studied the display for a moment, then looked up at her. "What would you recommend, Miss Morgan?" The question caught her off guard. People rarely sought her opinion on matters of taste or style. "Well," she said hesitantly, "it depends on what you prefer. The plain leather is most practical for everyday wear, but—" She reached for a band of dark brown leather with a simple but elegant tooled pattern. "This one would complement your hat nicely without being too ornate for a working man." He took it from her, his fingers briefly brushing hers, causing an unexpected jolt that made her withdraw her hand quickly. "I believe you're right," he said, examining the band. "This will do nicely. You have a good eye, Miss Morgan." "Thank you," she murmured, surprised by the compliment. Mrs. Winters had been watching the exchange with interest. "Hannah will replace your band for you, Mr. Anderson. It will only take a few minutes." "I'd appreciate that," he said, handing his hat to Hannah. As she worked carefully to remove the old band and attach the new one, Hannah was acutely aware of his presence. He stood at a respectful distance, looking at the various hats and bonnets on display, occasionally making a comment that elicited enthusiastic responses from Mrs. Winters. "There," Hannah said at last, presenting the hat to him. "All finished." He took it from her, examining her work with a critical eye before nodding in approval. "Fine workmanship," he said. "Thank you, Miss Morgan." The warmth in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. There was something in his eyes, a kindness, perhaps, or a recognition that made her heart beat a little faster. "You're welcome, Mr. Anderson," she replied, finding her voice steadier than she expected. He paid for the hatband, then paused before leaving. "I understand there's a church social coming up this Sunday," he said, addressing both women but looking at Hannah. "I suppose the whole town will be there?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Winters replied eagerly. "Everyone attends. It's quite the event." "You'll be there, won't you?" "I expect so," he said. "My employer mentioned it. Will you be attending, Miss Morgan?" Hannah blinked, surprised again to be directly addressed. Yes, I usually do," he nodded, seeming pleased by this information. "Then perhaps I'll see you there, ladies." With a tip of his newly banded hat, he departed, leaving Hannah with a strange flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Winters turned to Hannah with a speculative look. "Well," she said, "that was interesting." "What was?" Hannah asked, busying herself with returning her tools to their proper places. "He seemed quite attentive to you, dear." Hannah shook her head. "He was just being polite, Mrs. Winters. Men who look like that don't notice women like me." The older woman sighed. "Perhaps you're right. Still, it wouldn't hurt to wear your blue dress to the social. It's the most becoming one you have." Hannah didn't reply, but as she returned to her work, she couldn't help but think of the church social and wonder if the new foreman would indeed remember her there. It was a foolish thought, she knew, but she couldn't quite dismiss it entirely. The next few days passed in a blur of activity for Hank as he settled into his new position at the Anderson Ranch. The property was larger than he had expected, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land with a herd of nearly 2,000 cattle. The main house was an impressive two-story structure of locally quarried stone with a spacious bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a large barn, and various outbuildings. James Anderson, his employer, was a practical man in his 50s who had inherited the ranch from his father and expanded it considerably. His wife, Eliza, was a gracious hostess who made Hank feel welcome from the moment he arrived. Their 19-year-old daughter, Lucy, was pretty and vivacious, clearly accustomed to being the center of attention. "We're pleased to have you here, Mr. Anderson," Eliza said as they showed him around the property. "Your references from Texas were most impressive." "Thank you, madam," Hank replied. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." "My father built this ranch from nothing," James explained as they walked the property. "I've tried to honor his legacy by expanding it, but it's becoming too much for me to oversee alone. That's why we needed someone with your experience." Hank appreciated the older man's straightforwardness. "I understand, sir. I'll do my best to justify your confidence." The work was demanding but satisfying. Hank quickly assessed the strengths and weaknesses of the ranch hands, making mental notes of improvements that could be made to the operation. The men were initially wary of the new foreman, but his willingness to work alongside them and his fair treatment soon earned their respect. Each evening, Hank returned to the boarding house in town, too tired to do much more than eat dinner and retire to his room. He noticed that Hannah Morgan continued to keep to herself, speaking only when directly addressed and avoiding his gaze across the dinner table. The other boarders treated her with the same dismissive attitude he had observed that first night, and he found himself increasingly irritated by their behavior. On Saturday evening, the night before the church social, Mrs. Peterson served a particularly fine dinner in honor of the Sabbath. The conversation around the table was lively, with Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson both vying for Hank's attention. "Will you be attending the social tomorrow, Mr. Anderson?" Miss Roberts asked, her voice taking on a coy quality that Hank found vaguely annoying. "I will," he replied simply. "Mr. Anderson has kindly given me the afternoon off for the occasion." "How wonderful," Miss Wilson exclaimed. "Perhaps you'll save a dance for each of us." Hank smiled politely. "I'm not much of a dancer, I'm afraid." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Roberts said with a laugh. "A strong man like you must be light on his feet. We'll have you dancing before the afternoon is over." Hank noticed Hannah pushing her food around her plate, her expression carefully neutral. "Do you enjoy dancing, Miss Morgan?" he asked, causing all conversation at the table to cease abruptly. Hannah looked up, clearly startled by the direct question. "I don't dance often, Mr. Anderson," she replied softly. Miss Roberts let out a little laugh. "Hannah doesn't dance because no one asks her," she said in a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be heard. Hank's jaw tightened at the deliberate cruelty, but before he could respond, Mr. Perkins changed the subject to the recent improvements to the church where the social would be held. After dinner, Hank found himself on the porch again, smoking and enjoying the cool evening air. The sound of the door opening behind him made him turn, and he was surprised to see Hannah Morgan step outside, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Oh," she said, clearly not expecting to find him there. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he assured her. "It's a fine evening for enjoying the night air." She hesitated, then moved to stand at the far end of the porch, maintaining a respectable distance between them. The lamplight from inside fell across her face, highlighting the clean lines of her profile. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, Hank thought, but there was a quiet dignity in her bearing that he found appealing. "I wanted to apologize for Miss Roberts' behavior at dinner," Hannah said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the night sounds of the town. "She can be thoughtless sometimes." Hank raised an eyebrow. "It seems to me you're not the one who should be apologizing, Miss Morgan." She looked at him then, a question in her eyes. "You're very kind, Mr. Anderson, but I've grown accustomed to such things." "That doesn't make them right," he said firmly. A small smile touched her lips, so brief he almost missed it. "Perhaps not, but it does make them easier to bear." They stood in silence for a moment, the night wrapping around them like a comfortable blanket. Hank found himself wanting to know more about this reserved woman who accepted unkindness with such quiet resignation. "Have you lived in Pyramid City long?" he asked. "All my life," she replied. "My parents came here from Ohio before I was born, and they're no longer with you." He asked gently, noting the past tense. "They died of smallpox 5 years ago," she said, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the small scar above her eyebrow. "I was fortunate to survive." "I'm sorry for your loss," Hank said sincerely. "Losing family is never easy." She nodded, accepting his sympathy with the same quiet dignity she seemed to bring to everything. "And you, Mr. Anderson, what brought you to Nevada from Texas?" "A need for a change," he replied simply. "Sometimes a man needs to leave the past behind and start fresh." She seemed to accept this vague answer without pressing for details, another quality he found himself appreciating. Too many people in small towns wanted to know everything about a newcomer's business, but Hannah Morgan appeared content to let him keep his privacy. "Well," she said after another comfortable silence, "I should retire." "Good night, Mr. Anderson." "Good night, Miss Morgan," he replied, watching as she slipped back inside, leaving him with his thoughts and the stars overhead. As he finished his cigarette, Hank found himself looking forward to the church social with an anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. The thought of seeing Hannah Morgan in a setting where she might be more at ease, away from the critical eyes of her fellow boarders, was surprisingly appealing. There was something about her, a depth beneath her reserved exterior, that intrigued him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. With a final glance at the night sky, Hank stubbed out his cigarette and went inside, wondering what the following day would bring. Sunday dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Hannah woke early, as was her habit, but today she lingered a bit longer than usual, looking at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who gazed back at her was one she knew well, plain features, the small scar above her eyebrow, chestnut hair that refused to curl no matter how long she kept it in papers. "It's just a social," she told her reflection firmly, "just like all the others." But it didn't feel like all the others, and Hannah knew why. The brief conversation with Hank Anderson on the porch the previous evening had left her with a strange, fluttering feeling in her chest, a dangerous feeling, one that could lead to disappointment and heartache if she allowed it to grow. With a sigh, she reached for the blue dress hanging on her wardrobe door. It was her best, made of a soft wool that brought out the blue in her hazel eyes, with a modest neckline trimmed in cream-colored lace. Mrs. Winters had been right, it was her most becoming dress, though Hannah had few occasions to wear it after breakfast, which Hank Anderson did not attend, having left early for the ranch to complete his morning duties before the social. Hannah walked to church with Mrs. Peterson and the other boarders. The small wooden building was already filling with townsfolk dressed in their Sunday best, greeting one another with the familiarity of a close-knit community. Hannah slipped into a pew near the back, as was her custom, opening her hymnal as the organist began to play. She was so focused on the music that she didn't notice Hank Anderson enter until he slid into the pew beside her, his large frame dwarfing her more slender one. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," he said quietly, his deep voice sending an unexpected thrill through her. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, keeping her eyes firmly on the hymnal. "I hope your morning duties at the ranch weren't too taxing." "Nothing I couldn't handle," he assured her with a smile that she caught from the corner of her eye. Before they could converse further, Reverend Wilson, Miss Wilson's father, stepped up to the pulpit and the service began. Throughout the sermon, Hannah was acutely aware of Hank's presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the way his deep voice joined in the hymns with surprising melody for such a rugged man. After the service, the congregation made its way to the churchyard where tables had been set up for the social. The ladies of the church had outdone themselves with platters of fried chicken, ham, potato salad, cornbread, and pies of every description. A small group of musicians was setting up in one corner of the yard, preparing to provide music for dancing later in the afternoon. Hannah helped arrange the food on the tables, a task she volunteered for at every social as it gave her something to do, and a reason to avoid the awkwardness of standing alone while couples and families gathered in friendly groups. She was placing a pie on the dessert table when she felt someone approach from behind. "You're not planning to work the entire social, are you, Miss Morgan?" She turned to find Hank Anderson standing there, a plate in one hand and a questioning look on his face. "I'm just helping set up," she explained. "The ladies of the church committee appreciate an extra hand." "Admirable," he said with a nod. "But now that the tables are arranged, perhaps you do me the honor of joining me for a meal. I find these gatherings somewhat daunting when one doesn't know many people." Hannah blinked in surprise. Was he actually asking to sit with her? She glanced around, noting the curious looks already being directed their way. Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson, standing with a group of young people nearby, were watching with undisguised amazement. "Yes, thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, the expression warming his blue eyes in a way that made Hannah's heart skip a beat. "Excellent. Shall we fill your plate first?" Hannah allowed him to guide her along the food tables, selecting modest portions of the offerings. They found seats at one of the smaller tables, somewhat removed from the main gathering, which Hannah appreciated. "You're very quiet, Miss Morgan," Hank observed as they began to eat. "Is something troubling you?" She shook her head. "No, I'm just not accustomed to such attention," she admitted. He frowned slightly. "Is it unwelcome?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended, and she lowered her voice. "No, it's not unwelcome, it's just unexpected." He seemed to consider this for a moment. "People in small towns often form opinions too quickly and hold them too firmly," he said finally. "I prefer to make my own judgments." Before Hannah could respond to this surprising statement, they were interrupted by the arrival of James Anderson and his family. "Hank," the rancher greeted him warmly. "I see you're making friends already." Hank stood, and Hannah quickly followed suit. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Anderson, Miss Anderson," Hank said with a nod to each. "May I introduce Miss Hannah Morgan? Miss Morgan, my employers. We've met," Eliza Anderson said with a polite smile. Miss Morgan does beautiful work at the millinery shop. In fact, I'm wearing one of her creations today." She touched the cream-colored bonnet that Hannah had completed just days before. "It's lovely work," Hank agreed, his eyes meeting Hannah's with approval that made her cheeks warm. "Will you be joining the dancing later, Mr. Anderson?" Lucy asked, her pretty face alight with obvious interest. "Father says you were quite the horseman this morning. I imagine that translates to skill on the dance floor as well." "I'm afraid not, Miss Anderson," Hank replied with a smile that took the sting from his refusal. "I have 2 left feet when it comes to dancing, but perhaps Miss Morgan might be persuaded to join in. I understand the social is quite the event in Pyramid City." All eyes turned to Hannah, who felt herself flushing deeply under the scrutiny. "Oh, I don't usually." "That is, I'm not much of a dancer either," she stammered. "Nonsense," Eliza said kindly. "Everyone should dance at a social. It's practically a requirement." James Anderson nodded in agreement. "My wife is right. And speaking of dancing, I believe the musicians are ready to begin." "Shall we, my dear?" He offered his arm to his wife, who took it with a smile. "It was lovely to see you both," Eliza said. "Do enjoy the afternoon." As the Andersons moved away, Lucy casting a somewhat disappointed glance over her shoulder at Hank, Hannah found herself alone with him once more. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" he asked, his expression innocent. "Suggest I should dance. No one will ask me, and we both know it." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features in a way that made Hannah's breath catch. "Are you so certain of that, Miss Morgan?" Before she could respond, the musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form sets for a Virginia reel. "Miss Morgan," Hank said formally, standing and extending his hand to her, "would you do me the honor of joining me for this dance?" Hannah stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face, searching for any sign of mockery or pity. She found none, only a genuine invitation in his steady gaze. "But you said you don't dance," she protested weakly. "I'm willing to risk making a fool of myself if you are," he replied, his hand still extended. "What do you say?" The moment stretched between them, laden with possibility. Hannah was acutely aware of the stares from the townsfolk, the whispers already beginning as they noticed the handsome new foreman apparently asking plain Hannah Morgan to dance. "Yes," she said finally, placing her hand in his much larger one. "I would like that, Mr. Anderson." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and he led her to where the dancers were gathering. Hannah felt as though she were moving in a dream, the familiar churchyard suddenly transformed into someplace new and uncertain. As they took their places in the set, Hannah caught sight of Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson, their faces showing identical expressions of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Peterson, standing with a group of other matrons, was watching with her mouth slightly open, even Mrs. Winters, who had always been kind to Hannah in her own way, seemed unable to believe what she was seeing. "Ignore them," Hank said softly, bending close to her ear. "Just focus on the dance." Hannah nodded, taking a deep breath as the music began in earnest. The steps of the Virginia reel were familiar to her. She had watched it performed at countless socials, but participating was another matter entirely. She moved carefully at first, afraid of making a mistake, but Hank's steady presence and encouraging smile gradually helped her relax. He wasn't a particularly skilled dancer, as he had warned, but his enthusiasm and good humor more than made up for any missteps. When he twirled her during one of the figures, Hannah found herself laughing aloud, a sound so unexpected that it surprised even her. "There," Hank said with satisfaction as they completed a turn. "I knew you could laugh." The dance ended all too soon, and Hannah found herself flushed and breathless, but happier than she could remember being in years. As Hank led her from the dance floor, she was aware of the stares following them, but for once she didn't shrink from the attention. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said as they returned to their table. "That was enjoyable." "It was my pleasure, Miss Morgan," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "And I believe I've proven my point." "What point is that?" she asked, puzzled. "That you are indeed capable of dancing, and dancing well at that." I, on the other hand, demonstrated my complete lack of grace, as promised. Hannah couldn't help but smile. You weren't so terrible. Your kindness knows no bounds, he said with a mock bow that made her laugh again. The sound drew more curious glances, and Hannah became aware of Lucy Anderson watching them with a slightly petulant expression. I think Miss Anderson was hoping you would dance with her, Hannah observed quietly. Hank glanced in Lucy's direction and shrugged. Perhaps. But I already had a partner. The simple statement, delivered without fanfare, caused a warm glow to spread through Hannah's chest. She knew she shouldn't read too much into it. He was just being kind, after all, but she couldn't help the small bubble of happiness that had formed inside her. As the afternoon progressed, Hank remained by her side, engaging her in conversation about books she had read, discovering a shared appreciation for Dickens, and describing his experiences in Texas and the territories he had traveled through. Hannah found herself speaking more than she had in years, sharing stories of her childhood in Pyramid City and her parents' dreams for the small farm they had owned outside of town. What happened to the farm after they passed? Hank asked, his expression genuinely interested. It was sold to pay their debts, Hannah explained. There wasn't much left after that, just enough for me to secure a room at Mrs. Peterson's and my position at the millinery shop. That must have been difficult, he said, his voice gentle, losing your home and your parents in one blow. Hannah nodded, touched by his understanding. It was, but I was luckier than many. Sheriff Wallace helped me find work, and Mrs. Winters has been a fair employer. You've made a life for yourself, Hank observed. That takes courage, not courage, Hannah demurred. Necessity. Sometimes they're the same thing, he replied, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her look away first. As the sun began to set, signaling the end of the social, Hannah realized she had spent the entire afternoon in Hank's company, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by the townsfolk. She could feel the weight of their speculative gazes, hear the whispers behind hands, see the knowing looks exchanged between the matrons. I should help with the clearing up, she said, suddenly anxious to escape the scrutiny. I'll help you, Hank offered, standing when she did. They worked side by side, gathering plates and folding tablecloths, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Hannah was aware of Mrs. Peterson watching them with narrowed eyes, clearly trying to make sense of the unexpected development. As they finished their tasks and the church yard emptied of people, Hank offered his arm. May I walk you back to the boarding house, Miss Morgan? Hannah hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. They walked in comfortable silence through the twilight streets of Pyramid City, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above them. Hannah was acutely conscious of his solid presence beside her, of the firm muscle beneath her fingertips, of the occasional glances he cast her way. When they reached the boarding house, Hank paused at the bottom of the steps. Thank you for a most enjoyable afternoon, Miss Morgan, he said formally. It made my first social in Pyramid City far more pleasant than I anticipated. Thank you for asking me to dance, she replied softly. It's been a long time since anyone did. A shadow crossed his face. The men of this town must be blind, he said, his voice low but fervent. Before Hannah could form a response to this unexpected statement, the front door opened, spilling light onto the porch. Mrs. Peterson stood silhouetted in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Ah, there you are, she said. I was beginning to wonder if you'd lost your way. Supper will be served shortly. We'll be right in, Hank assured her, waiting until she withdrew before turning back to Hannah. Shall we? As they entered the boarding house together, Hannah knew that something had shifted between them, a tentative connection had formed, fragile but full of possibility. What she didn't know was whether it would withstand the scrutiny and judgment of a town that had long ago decided her worth. The days following the church social brought a subtle but noticeable change to Hannah's life in Pyramid City. The whispers continued, but now they carried a different tone, speculation and curiosity rather than dismissal. People who had barely acknowledged her existence for years suddenly found reasons to visit the millinery shop, their eyes appraising her as if seeing her for the first time. I hear Mr. Anderson was quite attentive to you at the social, Mrs. Winters remarked as they worked side by side, trimming hats for the autumn season. He seems like a fine gentleman. He was kind, Hannah replied cautiously, unwilling to feed the town's appetite for gossip. As a newcomer, he doesn't know many people yet. Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow. Is that all it was, kindness to a fellow outsider? I'm hardly an outsider, Hannah pointed out. I've lived here all my life. And yet, the older woman said thoughtfully, you've always seemed apart somehow. Hannah had no response to this observation, which struck uncomfortably close to the truth. She had always felt separate from the life of the town, even before her parents' deaths had left her truly alone. Perhaps it was this very quality that had drawn Hank Anderson's attention, one solitary soul recognizing another. At the boarding house, the atmosphere had changed as well. Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson had abandoned their initial shock in favor of renewed attempts to capture Hank's attention, while Mrs. Peterson watched the unfolding drama with shrewd eyes and pursed lips. For his part, Hank maintained a friendly but somewhat distant demeanor with the other boarders while seeking out Hannah's company whenever possible. They fell into a routine of evening conversations on the porch after dinner, weather permitting, or in the parlor when it didn't. These talks were conducted with perfect propriety, always in public spaces, always at a respectable distance, but they quickly became the highlight of Hannah's days. Hank told her about his life on the frontier, the cattle drives that had taken him from Texas to Kansas, the wild beauty of untamed landscapes, the characters he had encountered along the way. He spoke of his parents, both long dead, and his years working his way up from cowhand to foreman. There were gaps in his narrative, periods of time he glossed over, but Hannah didn't press him. Everyone had parts of themselves they preferred to keep private. She understood that better than most. In return, Hannah shared stories of her own life, her mother's skill with plants and remedies, her father's dreams of expanding their small farm, the books she had read, and the simple pleasures that sustained her. To her surprise, Hank listened as if her ordinary experiences were as fascinating as his adventures, his blue eyes focused intently on her face as she spoke. You have a way with words, Miss Morgan, he told her one evening as they sat in the parlor, a respectable distance apart on the horsehair sofa. You make me see things through your eyes. Hannah felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I think you're being generous, Mr. Anderson. My life has been rather uneventful compared to yours. Not every story needs to involve stampedes and gunfights to be worth telling, he replied with a smile. Sometimes the quiet moments reveal more truth than the dramatic ones. It was comments like these that confused and intrigued Hannah in equal measure. Hank Anderson spoke to her as if she were worthy of careful consideration, as if her thoughts and feelings mattered. It was so unlike her usual experience that she hardly knew how to respond. 2 weeks after the social, Hank rode into town on his day off and stopped by the millinery shop. Hannah looked up from the counter where she was arranging a display of new ribbons to find him filling the doorway, hat in hand. Good morning, Miss Morgan, he greeted her, nodding politely to Mrs. Winters, who was helping a customer in the back of the shop. I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, Hannah replied, noting the curious glances from the customer. How can I help you today? Actually, I was hoping you might be free for lunch, he said, his expression earnest. It's a fine day, and I thought perhaps we might enjoy a meal at the hotel restaurant. Hannah blinked in surprise. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Pyramid City, a place where important business was conducted and special occasions celebrated. It was not somewhere she had ever expected to be invited. That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly leave Mrs. Winters short-handed, she began, only to be interrupted by her employer who had approached without her noticing. Nonsense, Mrs. Winters said firmly. Business is slow today and you never take time for yourself, Hannah. Go and enjoy your lunch. You can make up the time tomorrow if you insist. Finding herself without further objections, Hannah removed her work apron and reached for her shawl. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. I'll be back in an hour. Take your time, dear. the older woman replied with a knowing smile that made Hannah blush. As they walked down the main street toward the hotel, Hannah was acutely aware of the stares following them. Hank, however, seemed completely at ease, his stride relaxed, his manner friendly as he greeted townsfolk they passed. "People are watching us," Hannah murmured, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. "Let them," Hank replied simply. "Does it bother you?" She considered this for a moment. "Not for myself. I'm used to being looked at or through by now, but you're new here, your reputation." "My reputation," he said with a gentle firmness that silenced her protests, "is my own concern, and I see nothing that could possibly damage it by enjoying lunch with a respectable young lady." The hotel restaurant was nearly full when they arrived, but the maitre d' quickly found them a table near the window. As Hank held her chair, Hannah caught sight of several prominent citizens of Pyramid City watching with undisguised interest the mayor and his wife, the bank president, and James Anderson himself, who was dining with a cattle buyer from California. "Hank," Anderson called, raising a hand in greeting. "Good to see you in town. Miss Morgan," he added with a polite nod. "Sir," Hank replied, returning the greeting before taking his seat across from Hannah. "Your employer seems surprised to see you here," Hannah observed quietly. Hank shrugged. "He knows it's my day off. I'm entitled to spend it as I choose." "With me," she said, the words more a question than a statement. His eyes met hers, steady and sincere. "Yes, with you. Is that so surprising?" "You know it is," she replied, a touch of her usual practicality returning. "Men like you don't typically seek the company of women like me." "Men like me," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And what kind of man do you think I am, Miss Morgan?" She gestured vaguely. "Handsome, capable, the kind of man who could have his pick of companions." A shadow crossed his face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Perhaps I've had enough of being chosen for my appearance or position," he said quietly. "Perhaps I value substance over show these days." Before Hannah could respond to this revealing statement, the waiter arrived to take their orders. The meal that followed was pleasant, filled with easy conversation and moments of shared laughter that drew more curious glances from the other diners. Hannah found herself relaxing in Hank's company, the initial awkwardness fading as it always did when they talked. As they finished their dessert apple pie that Hank declared was almost as good as what his mother used to make, he leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Miss Morgan Hannah," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I've enjoyed our conversations these past weeks." "As have I," she admitted, her heart beating a little faster at the use of her name. "I find myself looking forward to them more than anything else," he continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "To seeing your face, hearing your thoughts, it's become important to me." Hannah felt a flush rising to her cheeks. "Mr. Anderson," "Hank," he corrected gently. "I think we know each other well enough now." "Hank," she repeated, the name feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I don't quite know what to say. This is all so unexpected." "Is it?" he asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. "Have I been so unclear about my feelings?" "I've learned not to presume," she replied carefully. "And you should know that people are already talking. They're saying you could do better." A flash of anger crossed his face. "Better? By whose measure?" "By everyone's measure," she said, the words carrying the weight of years of judgment. "I'm not pretty, Hank. I'm not accomplished or wealthy. I'm just plain, ordinary." "Then I must not be a man," he said with such conviction that Hannah's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" "They said no man would want a woman so plain," he repeated, reaching across the table to take her hand in his. "If that's true, then I must not be a man, because I want very much to continue seeing you, Hannah Morgan, to court you properly if you'll allow it." Hannah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity, finding only sincerity and something warmer that made her breath catch. "Why?" she asked finally, the question that had been burning inside her since the church social. "Why me, when you could have any woman in town?" His thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "Because when I look at you, I see a woman of quiet strength and genuine kindness. I see someone who faces life's hardships with dignity." I see beauty that has nothing to do with the shape of your face and everything to do with the quality of your character." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "And if others can't see that, it's their loss, not yours." Hannah felt tears pricking at her eyes, unused to such words, such recognition of who she truly was beneath the exterior that had defined her for so long. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me court you," he replied, his voice gentle but certain. "Say you'll give us a chance to see where this might lead." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear in equal measure. Hannah knew that accepting would mean putting herself at risk of gossip, of mockery if he changed his mind, of heartbreak if his interest proved fleeting. And yet, looking into his eyes, she found herself willing to take that risk for the first time in her life. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. "Yes, I'll let you court me, Hank Anderson." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, aware of the public setting and the need for propriety. "Thank you," he said simply. "You won't regret it." As they left the restaurant together, Hannah was conscious of the stares and whispers that followed them, but for once, they didn't touch her. She walked beside Hank with her head held high, a new confidence in her step that came from being seen, truly seen by someone who valued what he found. The weeks that followed transformed Hannah's life in ways both subtle and profound. Hank courted her with a quiet determination that ignored the raised eyebrows and whispered comments of the townsfolk. He brought her wildflowers gathered during his rides around the Anderson ranch, walked her home from work each evening, and took her on Sunday afternoon drives in a buggy borrowed from his employer. Their courtship was conducted with perfect propriety, Mrs. Peterson made certain of that, appointing herself unofficial chaperone and ensuring that their time alone was limited and their behavior beyond reproach. But despite these constraints, or perhaps because of them, the connection between Hannah and Hank deepened with each passing day. Hannah found herself blooming under his attention like a desert flower after rain. She began to take more care with her appearance, not dramatic changes, but small touches like a ribbon in her hair or a brooch at her collar. She spoke up more in conversations, gradually shedding the protective silence she had wrapped around herself for so long. The town's reaction was mixed. Some, like Mrs. Winters, seemed genuinely pleased by the development. "It's about time someone recognized your worth, Hannah," she said one afternoon as they worked together. "Mr. Anderson seems like a good man," others were less supportive. Hannah overheard Miss Roberts commenting to Miss Wilson in the church vestibule one Sunday, "I can't imagine what he sees in her." Perhaps in Texas, the standards for feminine beauty are different, but the most significant change was within Hannah herself. For the first time in years, she began to think about the future with hope rather than resignation. She found herself writing in her journal not about the day's slights and disappointments, but about possibilities and dreams that suddenly seemed within reach. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hank brought up a subject they had not yet discussed. "Hannah," he said, his voice serious, "there's something I need to tell you about my past." She turned to look at him, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands were clasped tightly together. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "Before I came to Nevada, I was engaged to be married." Hannah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I see." "Her name was Elizabeth," he continued, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher in Texas, beautiful, educated back east. Everyone said we made a perfect match." Hannah remained silent, waiting for him to continue, trying to ignore the sick feeling of inadequacy that threatened to overwhelm her. "2 weeks before our wedding, she broke our engagement," Hank said, his voice flat. "She had met someone else, a lawyer from Austin with political ambitions. She said she couldn't see herself as a rancher's wife anymore, that she needed more than I could offer." "I'm sorry," Hannah said softly, meaning it despite the pain his story caused her. "That must have been difficult," he nodded, finally turning to look at her. "It was." Not just because she rejected me, but because I realized I had been fooling myself. I had been so caught up in the idea of having the perfect wife, the kind everyone expected a successful man to have, that I hadn't really seen Elizabeth for who she was. And she hadn't seen me. "Is that why you left Texas?" Hannah asked. "Partly," he admitted. "The humiliation was considerable, but more than that, I needed a fresh start, a chance to figure out what I truly wanted, not what was expected of me." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between his larger ones. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something, Hannah. What I feel for you isn't some reaction to being rejected or a rebellion against convention. It's deeper than that. When I'm with you, I feel seen for who I really am, not just the capable foreman or the handsome face, but the man beneath all that, the real me." Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I understand," she whispered. "I feel the same way. All my life, people have looked at me and seen only what's on the surface. You're the first person who ever bothered to look deeper." Hank's blue eyes were intense in the fading light. "I want to keep looking deeper, Hannah, for the rest of my life, if you'll let me." Her heart seemed to stop for a moment as she absorbed his words. "What are you saying, Hank?" "I'm saying I love you," he replied simply. "I think I started falling in love with you that first evening at dinner when I saw how you endured their unkindness with such quiet dignity. Every day since then has only deepened that feeling." Hannah felt as though she were dreaming, the moment too perfect to be real. "I love you too," she admitted, the words she had never expected to say to anyone flowing naturally from her heart. "I've been afraid to believe it, afraid to hope that this was real." "It's real," he assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "As real as anything I've ever felt." The front door opened behind them and Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat pointedly. "It's getting chilly out here," she announced. "Perhaps you should come inside, Miss Morgan." Hank released Hannah's hand with obvious reluctance. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson, we wouldn't want Miss Morgan to catch cold." As Hannah stood to follow the landlady inside, Hank caught her hand once more, pressing something into her palm. "Think about it," he whispered. "We'll talk tomorrow." In the privacy of her room, Hannah uncurled her fingers to find a small, polished stone, smooth and round, with bands of earthy colors running through it. She recognized it as one of the river stones Hank carried in his pocket. A habit he had explained came from his boyhood fascination with geology. Beneath the stone was a folded note. Hannah opened it with trembling fingers and read the simple message written in Hank's bold handwriting: "Marry me." Tears sprang to her eyes as the full meaning of their conversation on the porch became clear. This wasn't just a declaration of love, it was a proposal, offered with the same straightforward sincerity that characterized everything about Hank Anderson. Hannah clutched the stone to her heart, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through her. Joy, fear, disbelief, and above all, a love so powerful it seemed to transform her from the inside out. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her, not settling for her, not accepting her despite her plainness, but actively wanting her, seeing value in her that others had missed. Sleep was impossible that night. Hannah alternated between euphoria and doubt, between planning a future with Hank and fearing that it was all too good to be true. By dawn, she had made her decision, one that came not from desperation or gratitude, but from the certainty that she and Hank belonged together. The next day dragged interminably as Hannah waited for evening, when Hank would come to the boarding house as usual. She moved through her tasks at the millinery shop like a sleepwalker, her mind elsewhere. Mrs. Winters noticed her distraction but asked no questions, merely giving Hannah an understanding smile when she fumbled a simple stitch for the third time. When closing time finally came, Hannah hurried back to the boarding house, her heart racing. She had barely changed into a fresh dress when she heard Hank's familiar knock at the front door. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs, the river stone clutched tightly in her hand. He was waiting in the parlor, hat in hand, his expression anxious but hopeful. When he saw her, a smile spread across his face, transforming his features in that now familiar way that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "Hannah," he said simply, the word filled with emotion. "Mrs. Peterson is in the kitchen, Hannah told him, glancing toward the doorway to ensure they weren't overheard. We have a few minutes, he nodded, understanding her meaning. Have you thought about what I asked? In response, Hannah opened her hand, revealing the river stone resting on her palm. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. My answer is yes, Hank, I will marry you. The joy that blazed across his face was like nothing Hannah had ever seen. In 2 strides, he crossed the room and took her hands in his, careful not to violate the proprieties despite his obvious desire to embrace her. You've made me the happiest man in Nevada territory, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I promise you won't regret it, Hannah. I'll spend every day making sure of that. I know, she replied, her own voice thick with unshed tears of happiness. I trust you, Hank, more than I've ever trusted anyone. The sound of footsteps in the hallway warned them of Mrs. Peterson's approach. Hank stepped back to a respectable distance just as the landlady entered the parlor. Mrs. Peterson, he said formally, I've asked Miss Morgan to marry me, and she has done me the great honor of accepting. I hope we have your blessing. The older woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise, though Hannah suspected she had been expecting this development. Well, she said after a moment, this is sudden but not entirely unexpected. Have you spoken to Reverend Wilson yet? That's my next stop, Hank assured her. With your permission, I'd like to call for Hannah at 7 on Sunday to attend church together where we can announce our engagement properly. Mrs. Peterson nodded, a hint of a smile softening her usually stern features. That would be appropriate. Congratulations to you both. Thank you, Hannah said, touched by the genuine warmth in the landlady's voice, perhaps the first time she had heard it directed at herself. As Mrs. Peterson tactfully withdrew to give them a moment of privacy, Hank reached into his pocket and produced a small box. I have something for you, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a modest pearl. It's not fancy, but it's perfect, Hannah interrupted, her eyes shining as she looked at the ring. Absolutely perfect. Hank slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch gentle, his eyes never leaving hers. Like you, he said softly, perfect for me in every way. The news of Hannah Morgan's engagement to Hank Anderson spread through Pyramid City like wildfire, eliciting reactions that ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed disbelief. The announcement in church that Sunday caused a stir among the congregation, with many heads turning to stare at the couple seated side by side in Hannah's usual pew. Reverend Wilson offered his congratulations from the pulpit, his genuine pleasure in the match somewhat at odds with his daughter's frozen smile. After the service, Hannah found herself the center of attention for the first time in her life, receiving good wishes from people who had barely acknowledged her existence for years. I always knew you'd find a good man someday, dear, Mrs. Winters declared, embracing Hannah warmly. Mr. Anderson is very fortunate. Indeed he is, James Anderson agreed, shaking Hank's hand vigorously while his wife hugged Hannah. We couldn't be happier for both of you. When's the wedding to be? December, Hank replied, his arm around Hannah's waist in a public display of affection that would have been scandalous if not for their newly engaged status. Just before Christmas, we don't see any reason to wait. Well, you must let us host the reception at the ranch, Eliza Anderson insisted. It's the least we can do for our foreman and his bride. As they made their way through the crowd, Hannah overheard snippets of less congratulatory comments. Can you believe it? And what does he see in her? And it won't last, but they couldn't touch the bubble of happiness that surrounded her. Hank's hand was warm and steady on her waist, his pride in her evident in every glance, every word. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Hannah worked on her wedding dress in the evenings, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Mrs. Winters had insisted on ordering from San Francisco at her own expense. Consider it my wedding gift to you, she had said when Hannah protested the extravagance. Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day. Hank, meanwhile, was building them a home. James Anderson had offered him a parcel of land on the ranch property as a wedding gift, a gesture of appreciation for the improvements Hank had already made to the ranch's operations. With the help of the other ranch hands and a carpenter from town, Hank was constructing a modest but sturdy cabin that would be their first home together. "It's not much," he apologized when he took Hannah to see the progress one Sunday afternoon. "Just 2 rooms for now. But we can add on as our needs grow." Hannah stood in what would be their main living space, imagining the life they would build together within these walls. "It's perfect," she assured him, her eyes shining with happiness. "It's ours." As their wedding day approached, Hannah found herself the recipient of unexpected kindnesses from the townspeople. Mrs. Peterson helped her prepare a modest trousseau. The ladies of the church presented her with a handmade quilt for the marriage bed. Even Miss Roberts and Miss Wilson, perhaps resigned to the inevitable, contributed hand-embroidered handkerchiefs to her collection of bridal gifts. "People can surprise you," Hank observed one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, discussing the latest gesture of goodwill. When given the chance to be their better selves, they often rise to the occasion. Or perhaps they simply enjoy being part of a love story, Hannah suggested with a smile, even one as unlikely as ours. Hank took her hand, his thumb tracing the engagement ring on her finger. "There's nothing unlikely about us, Hannah. We make perfect sense. It just took us a while to find each other." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow that transformed Pyramid City into a scene from a Christmas card. Hannah stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the eastern mountains, hardly able to believe that by sunset she would be Mrs. Hank Anderson, Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Winters helped her dress, the older women fussing over every detail with maternal care that brought tears to Hannah's eyes. The ivory silk gown, with its modest neckline and long sleeves, transformed her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't that she suddenly became beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a radiance about her, a glow of happiness and confidence that no cosmetic could create. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, her usual brisk manner softened by the occasion. "Absolutely lovely." "Mr. Anderson won't be able to take his eyes off you," Mrs. Winters agreed, adjusting the simple veil that crowned Hannah's carefully arranged hair. The church was filled to capacity when Hannah arrived, escorted by Sheriff Wallace, who had volunteered to give her away in her father's absence. Music from the organ swelled as she began her walk down the aisle, but Hannah was aware of nothing but Hank, waiting for her at the altar, his face alight with love and pride. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They had chosen traditional vows, the familiar promises to love and cherish in sickness and in health, for better or worse, until death parted them. When Hannah spoke the words, her voice was clear and confident, free from the doubt and fear that had shadowed her for so long. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Wilson declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Anderson, you may kiss your bride." Hank's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a fitting beginning to their life together. As they turned to face the congregation, now husband and wife, Hannah felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never experienced before. The reception at the Anderson Ranch was more elaborate than Hannah had expected, with tables laden with food, a small band playing cheerful tunes, and even a decorated wedding cake sent from the finest bakery in Carson City. The great room of the main house had been transformed with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, creating a festive atmosphere that celebrated both their marriage and the approaching Christmas season. As Hannah and Hank moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes, she marveled at the change in how people addressed her. There was a new respect in their manner, a recognition of her status as Hank's chosen partner that went beyond mere courtesy. "Are you happy, Mrs. Anderson?" Hank murmured in her ear as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, the new name sending a thrill through her. "And you?" His blue eyes were warm with emotion as he gazed down at her. "I have everything I ever wanted right here in my arms." Later that evening, as they prepared to depart for their new home, Eliza Anderson approached Hannah with a small, wrapped package. "A little something to start your new life," she said with a warm smile. "Every home needs beauty." In the privacy of their cabin, Hannah opened the gift to find a delicate porcelain vase hand-painted with wildflowers. "For your table," the accompanying note read, "may your home always be filled with beauty and love." Hank placed the vase on the small table by the window, then turned to Hannah, taking her hands in his. "Welcome home, Mrs. Anderson," he said softly, "our home." As he drew her into his arms, Hannah felt the last of her doubts and fears melting away. In Hank's eyes, in his touch, in the home he had built for them with his own hands, she found the acceptance and love she had yearned for all her life. Not because she had suddenly become someone else, but because he had seen who she truly was all along. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, the intimacy of marriage new and wondrous between them, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely young woman who had believed herself destined for spinsterhood to the beloved wife she had become, it seemed like a miracle, or perhaps simply the natural unfolding of a love that had recognized its own truth from the beginning. "What are you thinking?" Hank asked, his voice drowsy with contentment as he pulled her closer. "I'm thinking that they were wrong," she replied, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "All of them. They said no man would want a woman so plain." "And I said I must not be a man," he finished, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But we proved them wrong, didn't we? Because I am very much a man and I want you more than anything in this world." "Yes," Hannah agreed, happiness filling her like light. "We proved them wrong." As she drifted towards sleep in her husband's arms, Hannah Morgan Anderson thought of the river stone Hank had given her with his proposal, now resting on their bedside table, ordinary at first glance, but revealing its true beauty to those who took the time to look more deeply. Like her. Like them. Like the love they had found together in the unlikeliest of places. The years that followed brought changes to Pyramid City and to the lives of Hank and Hannah Anderson. The town grew as the silver mines prospered and the railroad extended its reach. The Anderson Ranch thrived under Hank's management, eventually leading James Anderson to make him a full partner in the business when poor health forced him to reduce his own involvement. Hannah continued to work at the millinery shop for several years, her skills with needle and thread increasingly in demand as the town's prosperity grew. Eventually, she opened her own small shop specializing in fine embroidery and custom-made clothing, a venture that proved surprisingly successful. Their first child, a son they named James after Hank's partner and mentor, arrived a year after their marriage, a robust boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful demeanor. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, William, 2 years after that. Their home expanded along with their family additional rooms, a larger kitchen, a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch their children play. It was a house filled with love and laughter, with books and music and the small treasures of a life well lived. Hannah bloomed in the warmth of Hank's love and the joy of motherhood. The quiet confidence that had begun to emerge during their courtship developed fully over the years, and the townsfolk who had once dismissed her as plain Hannah Morgan came to respect Mrs. Anderson as a woman of substance and character. Not that old attitudes disappeared entirely. There were still those who wondered aloud how she had caught such a handsome and successful husband, who hinted that Hank must have settled for less than he deserved. But such whispers no longer had the power to wound her. Hannah knew the truth of their marriage, that it was built on mutual respect and genuine love, on seeing each other clearly and valuing what they found. On their 10th anniversary, Hank presented Hannah with a special gift, a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. "For your stories," he explained as she ran her fingers over the soft leather. "The ones you tell our children at bedtime. They should be written down, preserved for the future." "Do you really think they're worth preserving?" she asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Everything about you is worth preserving, Hannah," he replied, the love in his eyes as strong as it had been on their wedding day. "Your stories, your wisdom, your way of seeing beauty where others miss it." Our children and grandchildren should have the chance to know you as I do." Hannah began writing that very night, filling the pages with tales of pioneer life, with the wisdom passed down from her mother, with the small observations and insights that made up the texture of their daily existence. It became a cherished ritual, an hour each evening spent at her desk while Hank read nearby, the children asleep upstairs, the rhythms of their life together flowing like a river, deep and true. As their children grew, Hannah made sure they understood the lesson at the heart of her own story, that true beauty resided not in perfect features or fashionable appearance, but in character and kindness, in the courage to see beyond surface judgments to the person within. "Your father taught me that," she told them one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky. "He saw me when no one else did. That's because Papa is the smartest man in Nevada," young Elizabeth declared with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old. Hank laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair affectionately. "Not the smartest, perhaps, but wise enough to recognize a treasure when I found one." On a warm summer evening 25 years after their wedding, Hank and Hannah sat on their porch swing, watching their eldest son and his wife playing with their young children on the lawn. James had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a skilled rancher with an eye for innovation. Elizabeth, now a teacher at the Pyramid City School, would be married in the fall to a young doctor who had recently established a practice in town. William, their youngest, was away at university in California, studying engineering with the aim of improving irrigation systems for the region's farms and ranches. "Did you ever imagine our life would turn out this way?" Hannah asked, her head resting comfortably on Hank's shoulder, her hand in his as it had been countless times over the years. "Not the details," he admitted, his voice deeper now with age but still carrying the warmth that had first drawn her to him. "But I knew from the beginning that we would build something beautiful together." Hannah smiled, thinking of the journey they had traveled from the lonely young woman and the wounded newcomer they had been to the couple they had become. Surrounded by family, respected in their community, rich in the things that truly mattered. "They still talk about us sometimes, you know," she said, referring to the old-timers who remembered their unlikely courtship. "About how you chose the plainest girl in town when you could have had anyone." Hank turned to look at her, his blue eyes still clear and direct despite the lines that time had etched around them. In his gaze, Hannah saw what she always had: not blind love that refused to see her flaws, but a clear-eyed appreciation of exactly who she was, imperfections and all. "They never understood," he said, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar but never routine. "Beauty isn't about perfect features or fashionable looks, it's about the light that shines from within." He touched her cheek gently, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "And you, my love, have always been the most beautiful woman I've ever known." As the sun set over the Nevada mountains, casting its golden light across the land they had tamed together, Hannah leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful beyond words for the man who had looked past the surface to see her heart, who had loved her not despite her plainness, but with a completeness that transcended physical appearance entirely. "I love you, Hank Anderson," she whispered, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken all those years ago. "And I love you, Hannah Anderson," he replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come." In the gathering twilight, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together, Hannah thought once more of that long-ago day when Hank had first proposed, giving her a simple river stone along with his heart. Like that stone, their love had proven to be not flashy or ostentatious, but solid, enduring, beautiful in its own quiet way, a testament to the truth that real beauty, like real love, often reveals itself not at first glance, but to those patient and wise enough to look more deeply. And in that looking, to find a treasure beyond price.